So thanks, everyone. Yeah, so the motivation for this talk is really based on considering two sort of paradigms for robotic state estimation. So the first one is factor graph optimization, which I imagine most of you are familiar with. This is a super convenient modular modeling language that allows you to easily compose state estimation problems and provides automatic synthesis of estimators for solving them. Unfortunately, so think of it as like PyTorch or TensorFlow for state estimation of robotics. However, it's based on local optimization, and as a result, it is possible for techniques based in this way to converge to suboptimal solutions, and therefore these methods are not necessarily as reliable as we'd like, especially for safety-critical applications. On the other hand, there's a more recently developed class of estimators called certifiable estimation methods that are based on convex relaxation. So these often are capable of producing verifiably globally optimal solutions in practice and providing a posteriori certificates of optimality. So they're super reliable. However, they require solving very large-scale convex relaxations, which requires the use of specialized optimization methods that often have to be hand-designed in order to be efficient. And so they're not necessarily the most user-friendly tools to use, which has been a major barrier to their more widespread adoption because they require a lot of specialized knowledge and a lot of custom hand-designed to implement. So the main question in this talk is it possible for us to be able to combine these naturally complementary paradigms in such a way that we can achieve the best properties of both? So the main thing that we provide in this paper is to show that it is indeed possible to combine factor graph optimization and certifiable estimation into a unified framework in such a way that you get the ease of use of factor graphs together with the reliability of certifiable estimation. In particular, what we show is that you can actually implement and deploy certifiable estimators using standard factor graph methodologies and workflows like GDSAM. So it's super easy to use using tools you already are familiar with. While at the same time endowing existing factor graph methods with certifiable global optimality guarantees. So you really get the best of both worlds. The setup for this is based on the observation that many maximum likelihood or state estimation tasks in robotics can be naturally formalized as factor graph problems in which the maximum likelihood estimator itself has the form of a quadratically constrained quadratic program. That is an optimization problem in which both the objectives and the constraints defining the state are defined by quadratic functions. And so what's interesting about this is we now have two sort of structures that are simultaneously present in these problems. We have the algebraic structure in the form of QCQP and the factor graph model that describes the conditional independence relations that obtain for these large-scale summation problems that we want to solve. And so one natural question then is, what is the relation between these two structures? The first thing we discuss in this paper, or the first insight that we sort of leverage in this paper, is the observation that factor graph structure essentially is encoded or is encoding block sparsity patterns in the data matrices that define the objectives for your problem and the constraints for your states. So in particular, the connectivity of the factor graph corresponds to the block sparsity pattern of the objective matrices, and the fact that these factor graphs are typically defined over product manifolds implies that these constraint matrices have a very characteristic block diagonal structure. Okay, so how do we use this then? Given a QCQP, there's a fairly, an estimation problem in the form of a QCQP, there's a fairly standard way of generating certifiable estimators for this class of problems. And it consists of two basic transformations. The first one is we're going to apply just sort of the very well-known Shor's relaxation in which we replace this outer product, this quadratic outer product, with just a generic PSD matrix. This gives us a convex relaxation in the form of an STP, and a large body of both theoretical and empirical work recently has shown that these FTP relaxations are actually capable of producing exact globally optimal solutions to many state estimation problems in practice. This gives us, in principle, an efficient way of generating globally optimal solutions. Unfortunately, the cost that you pay for this is that these semi-definite variables are extremely large, and so existing off-the-shelf STP optimization techniques are typically not sufficient to solve these in practice. And so the second transformation that we employ is to exploit the fact that we know that this particular family of STP methods admits low-rank solutions. And we can search for those low-rank solutions specifically, efficiently, by assuming that they can be parameterized via a low-rank factorization and then applying fast standard nonlinear programming techniques to search for these low-rank factors. This is a technique called Beer-Montero factorization. Okay, so the main thing I want to point out about this is that if you look at this sequence of transformations, what you will notice is that what is changing here is the parameters or the parameterization that is used for the decision variables. The data matrices that define these problems remain the same throughout this entire sequence. It's the same data matrices that appear in all these problems. And because we saw on the previous slide that these data matrices are what encode factor graph models, the fact that these data matrices are preserved throughout this entire sequence of factor graph transformations implies that both of these problems actually inherit a factor graph structure from this initial QCQP. And so in particular, what that means is that we can actually instantiate and locally optimize this family of Beer-Montero factorizations as factor graph models in factor graph libraries like GTSAM, using exactly the same optimization techniques that you're already familiar with from these libraries. Okay, so what these observations gets us, the actual practical payoff of this, is that this leads to a very simple algorithm for performing certifiable, that is verifiably globally optimal state estimation inside factor graphs. And the model is, the method is quite simple. It just consists of repeatedly constructing and solving sequences of these higher dimensional lifted factor graphs that correspond to these Beer-Montero factorizations, applying totally standard vanilla factor graph optimization in the usual way that you're familiar with, and then simply checking whether or not the output of that, those higher dimensional lifted factor graph optimizations in fact correspond to global optimal solutions for your short relaxation, which we can do because this problem is convex and therefore its optimality can be checked using the usual KKT conditions. So the main things I want to point out here are just that all this algorithm is it's a super lightweight meta algorithm that just wraps around local factor graph optimization. Yet it guarantees the recovery of globally optimal solutions to these generally intractable state estimation problems. And this entire process can be automatically synthesized, instantiated, and run directly from the usual standard input factor graphs that you're already using inside your state estimation system. We've implemented this inside GTSAM. We've run it on a variety of state estimation tasks for mapping and navigation. Main point here is that this approach matches the performance of existing purpose-built problem-specific certifiable estimators for large-scale benchmarks and preserves the computational speed of existing local factor graph methods. So you really get the best of both. Yeah, happy to chat more at the poster. Look forward to speaking more about this. Thanks.